Oh, was that her one?
No, Quentin, old lady Quentin from Quentin. And her grandfather was named Jacob. He was a Jew, but anyhow, he was half Jew and half Choctaw. But anyhow, they came down here, what's that man's name from Muskogee? Foreman,
Grant Foreman.
yeah, Grant Foreman came down and was interviewing Mama. And he told her that he was going to go over and see old lady Quentin. And he said, I've had one interview with her and I got some wonderful information. Mama said, let me tell you something about that old lady. She couldn't tell the truth when she was young, much less when she was 120. He said, well, it makes wonderful writing. She said, I'm sure it does. She's got a great imagination. But the older you get, the more historical you get, whether you know anything or whether you're accurate or not. That's one of the troubles with history.
Right.
That's right.
People kind of inclined to fix it up a little, like Johnson and a few of those, writing their own histories.
Today is March 6th, 1984. This is Joe Todd, an interview with McCurtain Scott. Is that correct? Oh, good. Mr. Scott, where were you born?
Kinta,
When's your
Oklahoma.
birthday?
July 10, 1914.
Who's your father?
George W. Scott.
And your mother?
Alice McCurtain.
Were they both from Oklahoma?
Indian Territory.
Indian Territory. What kind of work did your father do?
Originally, he was a rancher. Then he was originally he was a cowboy. He came up here from Hugo, or Goodland. And he had cattle. He was an orphan. And he was left cattle. But he left home when he was 16, and he got up here in Sanborn County when he was about 19. And he was a cowboy then for my grandfather. And then he married my mother in 1896. Let's see, he would have been 24. And then he became a treasurer of the Choctaw Nation. And he sold his cattle down in Hugo. He'd been kind of running back and forth. Then he sold his property and his cattle. He had property in Red River County, Texas, and in Oklahoma. And he sold that and came up here and took his allotment out at Fish Creek in this county. And then later on he went into banking. He had the bank in Kinta, and he had a dry goods store, and he had a lumber company and a sawmill.
Oh, really?
And he was very active in business, and he also studied law.
Where did you go to school?
He only went to Indian schools. He went to Spencer Academy, which was a boarding school.
Where was that located?
It was down close to Hugo, close to the present, Fort Towson, close to Fort Towson.
Yeah. Okay.
There isn't a town there anymore. And he went to the 8th grade, through the 8th grade. He was offered a scholarship to Harvard, but he was an orphan and his aunt wouldn't let him go. So that was the extent of his formal education. But he always read a lot. He was a very well-read person. And as I say, he had all the law books that he studied. That's the way they did it in those days. But he never practiced. Then in 1916, he moved to Stickler. See, that was after my grandfather had died and the Choctaw government was dissolved.
How come it came to Stickler?
Because his bank failed in Kinta. And he was bankrupt. And he gave all of his assets to his creditors and started over in 1916 over here. And it was kind of a poor start because he didn't have any job, he didn't have any money, and we more or less lived on the children's land. Our older brother and sister had allotments, and my mother had allotments, and just one at a time we sold them, mortgaged them and sold them and lived on it until 1929, and he formed an abstract title company, and he worked at that until he died in 1945.
Now he was born in 76?
He was born in 72.
72. And
he had one sister, younger than he, and she died. She was going to school over at New Hope Academy in Spiral, Oak Lodge, and she died when she was 16.
Did your father ever talk about Spencer Academy,
No.
going to school there?
No, the only thing I remember about it was that his friends, he talked to his friend, he had a friend named Hampton Tucker, who was a distant relative on the Folsom side. And he used to come and visit my dad, and he would talk about the days that they were in Spencer together. But my dad never mentioned it.
When did he become treasurer of the Choctaw Nation?
I think he was 21 years old.
The 1893.
Mm-hmm.
How does one become treasurer of the Choctaw Nation?
I imagine that he was sort of a favorite of my grandfather's. About all I could figure out. He was pretty young to earn it.
And that's when your grandfather was, they called the chief or governor?
They called him governor.
Governor.
The Choctaws did. But see, my mother was in school in Fort Smith at Sisters of Mercy convent. And they didn't marry until 96. So that he had already been treasurer when he married my mother, but I'm sure my grandfather had his eye on him.
What was your father like?
Well, he was a quiet man and introverted. He was a very brilliant mind, but he wasn't much at speaking. And he was a large man. He weighed over 200 pounds. And he had black hair and blue eyes. He was 1/8 Choctaw and 1/8 Chickasaw. And his father was a white man. His father was a doctor.
Now, your grandfather, McCurtain, did you know him?
No.
You didn't know him. Now, is this his home they're restoring over here?
That's one of his homes, yes.
One of his homes. How many did he have?
Well, he only had one at a time, but he died in Kinta, up on the south of Kinta on the hill. He wasn't living at Samboy when he died. And I believe he moved from Samboy to Kinta about 1902, and he died in 1910.
Now, this home here, was it Did it become the residence of the governor of the nation, or was it just his home?
It was his own home.
His own
It
home.
didn't belong to the government.
Okay. Did the government have a home for the governor? Have
You
heard-
see, he already had it when he was elected.
Okay. Have you heard any stories about your grandfather?
Oh yeah, I've heard a lot of stories.
Can you tell us some of them?
Not right now, I don't think. Maybe sometime later. I'd have to recollect them.
Yeah, okay. What about the removal? Any stories about coming from Mississippi?
Grandpa was born in the Indian Territory here.
Mm-hmm.
Now his older brother Jackson McCurtain was born in Mississippi, but he was born over. He was born. Now he had written in a letter that he was born 16 miles north of the Winding Stair Mountain on the old military road from Fort Smith to Fort Towson, near a creek there. There is no town there then, and there's no town there now. I don't know exactly where it is. But he went to school one term, Grandpa did, to a man named W.W. Wilson, who was a white man. And that's all the formal education he had. He was in the Civil War as a scout for Uncle Jack, who was a colonel in the Choctaw regiment.
Colonel Jack?
McCurtain. And he lived with Uncle Jack after his mother and father died over at Red Oak. And when he met Grandma, I understood that he met Grandma in Fort Smith at one of the hangings. You know how they used to go, the old timers used to go to witness hangings.
Judge Parker's hanging.
Mm-hmm. And Grandpa was there, and Grandma and her people had come from Tuskahoma up to witness the hangings, and they met in Fort Smith.
Have you heard any Civil War stories when he was a scout?
No, not really.
Hey, how long did you live in Kinta?
How long did I live in Kinta? 2 years.
2 years. So you don't have any memories of it?
No.
So in 1916 you moved to Stickler. What are your first memories of Stickler?
I remember World War I. I had the flu. That's my first memory. And I remember we had a colored lady working for us. And she used to scare me about the Germans. She said, Germans are going to get you if you don't behave. And I remember that. So it must have been during the war.
Of course, the flu epidemic was 1918 also.
Mm-hmm.
Do you remember any kind of medicines they gave you for the flu?
No. I only remember waking up and my eyes were stuck together and I couldn't see. And I remember I had to learn to walk again. But I don't recall any of the details, the treatment.
Do you remember Armistice Day?
No.
And where did you start school?
Where, when?
Where? Both. Where and when?
I guess I was 6 years old. Started down at Boone School here.
Boone School?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. How big was the school?
It was a 2-story building with, at that time, I believe it had all 8 grades.
Who was your favorite teacher there?
Well, I believe I liked Mrs. Anderson, Mrs. Joe Anderson better.
What'd you like about her?
Well, she was kind.
As a little boy, what chores you do around the house?
You know, I don't recall anything besides bringing in wood. We lived in town.
Mm-hmm.
I don't recall. There were so many of us in the family.
How many?
Well, I had brothers and sisters who died, so at any one time, there were 13 of us in all. Mm-hmm. And 6 of us lived to grow up, 7 of us lived to grow up, and 6 of them died early on.
Mm-hmm. What kind of work did your father go into after he came to Stickler?
Well, he didn't do any there for about 13 years, except we still had some property of my mother's and my brother's, and he had cattle, and he cut hay and planted oats and tried to run a ranching operation, but we didn't. It was kind of bad times there in 21. Cattle got down very cheap, and we didn't make a very good success out of the farming operation. Mm-hmm. But that's about all he did until he started his abstract company in 29.
Did your father ever talk about the Great Depression of 1907 in the banking business?
No.
Because there were 2 depressions, one in the 30s and 1907.
It was a pretty good one in the 22 too, as far as cattle people were concerned.
What caused that depression in 22?
I don't know. I would have been 8 years old.
Mm-hmm. Do you remember any specific, I'll call them Choctaw stories from your childhood?
Well, no, not really, except I remember my mother talking about Willis Folsom, the old Choctaw preacher, and what a fine person and a fine preacher he was. But you know, I think I better more or less set you straight about our childhood. We weren't really raised in the Indian culture. Mm-hmm. I don't recall even anything different about our home life than the neighbors who were not Indian, because Mama was not one to dwell on the past. She was, and Papa too, were determined to get us educated and get us out in the world, making a living. Mm-hmm. And we didn't. Mama was always very involved in Indian affairs, but that was in current Indian affairs, not in the past. She was charitable, and she knew any Indian was sick or in difficulty or hungry or anything, she did something about it. But she was also in politics, and she tried to get them jobs and try to get them in schools and that sort of thing. But we didn't talk about Indian history and Indian lore, not in our family.
Mm-hmm. Okay, now your mother, you were 1/8 Choctaw.
No, my father.
Your father
was 1/8 Choctaw and 1/8 Chickasaw, and my mother's father was full blood. Mm-hmm. Well, 7/8.
What percentage are you?
We always felt that we were 7/16, but we're enrolled as 5/16 because my father only enrolled his Choctaw blood. He's enrolled as an 8th Indian, but he was an 8th Choctaw and an 8th Chickasaw. Mm-hmm. But you couldn't enroll yourself on both rolls. you couldn't enroll on the Choctaw roll and on the Chickasaw roll too. And he was only an 8 Choctaw, so that's what he enrolled, see. You really should have let him enroll as a quarter Choctaw, since they were going to let him only on 1 roll, but he wasn't a quarter Choctaw. So that's why we're listed as 5/16.
Okay.
Now we went every year to the Choctaw meetings
Where were they held?
after they started them over at Wilburton, at the Capitol, not at Wilburton, Tuskahoma. We went every year.
What was the purpose of that meeting?
Oh, it was mostly socials from our standpoint, but the Choctaws usually had a little money coming in from somewhere, and they wanted to hear about it. But there wasn't very much. It was just dribbles, wasn't it? Just dribbles and dabs, maybe $25 distribution. And we weren't, we didn't have very much government in those days. But we went to see all the Choctaws. Then we didn't go to, when I was a child, we used to go to church at Bethel over here, between here and Samboy, south of here. But I don't know what happened, whether that church disorganized or what.
No,
I don't know what happened to it, but
it's still.
is it still there?
They have a couple of trustees
Mm-hmm.
and a preacher that comes every so often.
But Mama always went down to the Baptist church here because it's close. We only lived a block away. And the Baptists split. And part of them went out on Main Street, established a church, and the other part stayed close to home. The ones that split had their church in front of the house at first. Then they moved to Main Street. While they were in front of the house, Mama went to that church. Then when they moved up to Main Street, she transferred to the one closer. And they came from the first church and persuaded her to go back to the Main Street. And she said, well, I don't believe in going past one church to go to another. So she stayed in the one she was going. And I imagine that's why we quit Bethel, because this one was closer. But the children were Methodist, and Papa was Presbyterian, because that's what Spencer Academy was, Presbyterian school. And I was a Methodist because I believed in dancing, and the Baptists didn't.
Tell me about some of the dances you went to.
Well, I was a Sigma Chi in the Sigma Chi fraternity at OU, and I went to every dance they had, and a lot of others.
When did you first go to OU?
1936.
1936.
Mm-hmm.
Let me go back about the Depression of the 30s. How did that affect you and your family?
Well, we were, I don't suppose an awful lot, because we didn't have anything before. You see, there wasn't what you would call discrimination here socially. But I think it was just more or less that the people who were living here and running the town were all sort of connected. They'd all come here from Arkansas. They were all white. And they had all the jobs in the stores and in the county offices and in the post offices. And Indians couldn't find a job in anything. But that was true before the Depression started. It was just a little more true because there were fewer jobs. But we didn't have any anyhow. No one in the family was working before the Depression. So it wasn't all that different.
Tell me about Mr. Stigler. Who was he?
Bill Stigler?
Yeah, the name of town after.
Well, excuse me, he was a son of Sim Stigler, who was a white man, and Mary Folsom, who was Indian. And he was a handsome, articulate man. He was a U.S. representative. Before that, he was a Choctaw attorney. And he was a Sig Galp at OU. And then in the social life at the university, he was a lawyer. And he was always very attentive to Indian people personally. Mm-hmm. I don't know that much about his effectiveness as a congressman or as a representative of the Indians. I knew him personally and I liked him.
How come they named the town after him?
I don't know. I believe that Mary Stigler's allotment was here, his mother. Sim Stigler was a fine old man, but you know, he looked a lot like he was Choctaw. But if he was, he didn't know it. He was very dark. And he had black eyes and black hair.
Where is he from?
Mississippi.
Mississippi.
I remember one time, he had a very good sense of humor, the old man did. And I remember one time he was sitting in the office with his feet on the desk, and my sister told him, she said, I've been reading the paper where Mr. Charlie Sigmund and Lloyd Sigmund, who were the sort of the founders of the town, builders of the town, I've been reading where they came here with only a hammer and a saw, made their fortunes here. And Mr. Stigler said, that's not the way I heard it, Catherine. I heard they came with a screwdriver and a chisel.
That happened a lot.
But anyhow, they were, I didn't know Charlie Sigmund, but Lloyd Sigmund was a nice neighbor, nice man. But that was his way of being funny, I guess.
Mm-hmm. You went to OU 1936.
I went to OU in 36 and 37, and before that I went to Warner Junior College in 30.
Did you go
Two
on
and
scholarship?
33. No.
What did you study?
I studied a little bit of everything because it was depression and you couldn't work. When I went to Warner, I didn't study much of anything. I played tennis mostly. But then in 33 and 34, I went to Ann Arbor, Michigan. My brother was a student athlete there, played football. And I went up there to help him with his books and to go to school myself. But I really only went one semester at Ann Arbor. I studied in the library a lot.
How did you, in the Depression years, how did you afford your tuition?
I worked
What kind of jobs you work at?
in restaurants. Mm-hmm. And my sisters, Catherine and Yvonne, sent me money. They were school teachers.
And
my father couldn't.
Yeah.
And I went to, then I went to work in Washington, D.C. in the Commercial Intelligence Department of Bureau of Foreign Domestic Commerce. Mm-hmm. And while I was there, I went to Georgetown in Washington, D.C. and took foreign service for 3 years. Then I went in the Army, and after I came out, I went to OU again and finished my law.
So you have a law degree. You have a BA and another?
No.
Okay.
I have an LLB from OU, and I passed the bar in 48.
Where'd you stay at OU? Did you stay on campus or off campus?
I lived in, When I first went up there, I lived in the Masonic dorm, and then I moved in the Sigma Chi house when I pledged. Then after I came back from World War II, I didn't reaffiliate, and I moved in a dorm out on Wilson Center.
Were you drafted or enlisted?
Well, I don't know what you'd call it. I was called in the draft, and I flunked the physical with high blood pressure. That was in the summer of 41. Then I went down to the beach on doctor's orders and rested, because I'd been running around quite a bit in Washington, going to school at Georgetown and working all day and going to parties and dances at the girls' schools, and I was kind of run down. 1941. And one reason I volunteered, other than the general reason of being patriotic, it was also economic, because if I had enrolled again that fall at Georgetown, I was a senior there, and had I enrolled and got called in the Army, I wouldn't get my money back, because they didn't reimburse you if you got called in the Army. So I thought, well, I'll just go in for a year, and when I get out, I'll finish. But I didn't go back there. Had all the foreign service I wanted.
Right. What were you doing December 7th?
I was sitting on my bunk at Fort Knox. I'd finished armored training school, and I was waiting to go to the 1st Armored Division, where I was going to be assigned, when I heard it on the radio.
What was your reaction?
Well, I didn't have time to react at the time. The boy sitting on the bunk next to me was from Philadelphia, and he was very young. I was 27. He was like 19 or 20, and he fainted. I didn't hear what the news was. I just heard him go, whoa, and fall over on the bed. So I ran in the latrine and got a cold towel and came out and threw it on his face. And he came to, and he looked at me and he said, war, and fainted again. And I then turned to the radio and I heard what they were saying. But as I say, my reaction was so confused with my reaction of him fainting. We were all laughing at him for fainting. And of course, I'm sure I was, I don't know, because we kind of expected it anyhow.
Where'd you go through basic training?
At Fort Knox.
Fort Knox. What do you think of basic training?
I enjoyed it. I did. I'd been working as a typist for 4 years in an office, and I was happy to get out. I always liked outdoors anyhow. I was happy to get out, and I didn't mind anything I had to do. I minded some of the things I couldn't do, but I didn't mind any of the training. It wasn't hard for me. I was physically pretty active.
What did you do during the war?
Well, mostly I worked for the commanding general of the division.
First Army?
I was a secretary to the commanding general.
What was his name?
Well, I worked for more than one of them. I stayed in the same section, and we had a succession of generals. The general who promoted me from private, well, he hired me as a private, was General Magruder, who was over age and grade at Fort Knox. When I went in the service, I didn't particularly want to work in an office. So I didn't put down any of my credentials that would have put me in an office. But I was cleaning latrines because I didn't have any skills of record. And I got tired of that. So I told the sergeant major that I could do a few other things to get out of the latrine. So he put me in the adjutant general section typing. And there was a ball game one day, and I wanted to hurry and get to the ball game. And I was going pretty fast, which I could do. I could do 100 words a minute on typewriter because I'd been typing for a living, you know. So I pulled that last abstract out, and I looked up, and there was an officer standing behind me watching me. He said, "I never saw anybody run a typewriter like that." He said, I said, "Well, I was in a hurry to go to the ball game, sir." And he said, "Would you like to work for the general? His boy's going off to school. And if you'd like to work for him, I believe he could use you." I said, "I'd be okay." So I did. I went to work for General Magruder. Then he got replaced by General Ward because Magruder was overage and grade to go overseas. General Orlando Ward of Denver. Then I worked for him as long as he was in the division. He promoted me to warrant officer, and I stayed in that position until he left just before the end of the war in North Africa and was replaced by General Harmon, who came from General Patton's 2nd Armored Division. In the meantime, General Patton became an Armored Corps commander of the 1st and 2nd Armored Divisions, Armored Corps, 2nd Armored Corps. And he sent his chief of staff down, Harmon, to take over when we were stalled in North Africa. And then the war was over, and shortly after, Harmon wasn't there long. The war was over, we won the North African situation. And we went into Italy, and Harmon was with us all through Anzio. And then we had a succession of generals, and I don't even remember some of their names.
What do you remember about North Africa?
Well, it was a lot wetter and damper and more uncomfortable from cold than the G2 people had figured, because we weren't outfitted for that kind of weather. We like to froze to death. But when it was, after the winter was over, it was beautiful country and dry, and everybody felt great. It was a healthy country. But it was a very, difficult time for the American soldiers, because we were outgunned and outmaneuvered and beaten, really, in the skills of war by the Germans. The Air Force, I suppose, saved us.
What did you think when you first saw the Germans?
I was just more or less curious. I didn't have any particular hate for the Germans. Just curiosities about them.
What was that big battle in North Africa that the first time we met the Germans?
First time we met the Germans was at McNassy in a wheat field in North Africa. The first time the 1st Armored Division met them.
And what happened?
Well, I think the Americans won that skirmish. No, it was not at McNassy. It was Sened Station, Sened. And I think McNassy was later. I'm going to have to go. I'll have to come back this afternoon sometime.
Yeah, okay.
Because I have to meet my boys out the farm.
Okay.
Oh, let me snap a picture.
A lot of ideas that the Choctaws had learned to entertain these ideas and to speak about them, but they didn't have any words that covered them. And they had to string words together to convey that meaning. And if you do string some of these words together, these abstract words, these words for things, string them together and verbs together, you'd have something crazy sounding in English. If you just, so you'd have to have someone who was fluent in Choctaw and fluent in English too, and understood what Choctaw was trying to say. Well, Mama wouldn't, she wouldn't turn her letters loose.
You mean there's no abstract?
They didn't have words for things like, well, there's no word for abstract in Choctaw. See, there's no word for, well, they will call a person a liar, but I don't think, is there a word for honesty in Choctaw? I doubt it. You have to say that they don't lie. See, they didn't have words for your, hulabi is to lie. Yeah, hulabi. But there isn't a word for let's say like you say. Well, any of those big long Latin words that we use for philosophy and sociology and things like that, they didn't have words for it because they only had around 900 or 1,000 words. And they had names of things. And if they wanted to refer, like I think about the worst thing you could call anybody in Choctaw was a mangy dog. They didn't have curse words. And they took exception to, well, you know, you refer to a mangy dog, that's a pretty low thing, you know. And if you call somebody that, that's just about as bad as you could call them in Indian. Because they just didn't have a lot of words. But they knew, though, since they learned English, they had these ideas and they knew these words, but they couldn't use one word to convey the language, the idea in Choctaw. They'd have to build it up out of things.
And everything seemed a little backward.
Yeah.
You'd start from the front.
Yeah, well, that's true in a lot of other languages.
And you translate.
You know, like the verbs on the end in German, you know. He too soon out of the train got, you know, the Germans will say. But, and Latin's that way, verbs on the end. But the thing about the Choctaw language, I was just telling her that there were politicians who were very good orators in Choctaw, but they had just learned how to string these words together in such a way that they could convey these abstract ideas, and the Choctaws could understand them. But they couldn't on their own, just like us. We understand someone like Jesse Jackson. We couldn't all get out and orate like he does. But he uses the same vocabulary that we have, but he uses it in a different way, and that's the way with some of the Choctaw speakers. They had some very fluent speakers in those days that were just as spellbinders like you have today in politics. And they did it in Choctaw.
How's now you say the verb was at the beginning of the sentence?
I really don't know. I don't know Choctaw. I just know a few words from I hear.
What language group is Choctaw? You know?
It's more related. I think it's closer to the Creek than it is to the...
They call it the Muskogee.
No, the Muskogee now, isn't that the Cherokee? That's a Creek, yeah. That's a Creek.
No, there was they had the languages divided up into certain groups.
There's different language groups.
It's nothing like Cherokee.
Yeah.
But it's
Muskogee
Chickasaw and Choctaw are almost the same, you know.
So you have like the Aztecan, Algonquin.
The Algonquin was Eastern Indian.
And that's
But
mainly.
now I'm just talking about what I've learned now, you know, from books and things, school and stuff. But I understood from what I've read, Choctaws came from somewhere near the water. And they think it was either California or Mexico or somewhere. They came and made a long trip out here. And the Cherokees came from upstate New York and Pennsylvania around in there, so they weren't related at all.
Yeah.
But the Choctaws seemed to look a little bit more like the Creeks.
Just a little bit, and I can turn it over.
Oh, I didn't know that thing was on. I'd have been nervous. But
Turn it over.
it was one of the things that was a deterrent as far as giving up letters. Mama wanted them translated because, see, she could understand Choctaw.
Yeah.
She could speak it some, but since she learned Choctaw before she learned English, but she had been away from it so long that she could understand everything, but she couldn't converse herself that well.
I've heard that Choctaw and Chickasaw can read each other's language, but they can't understand it.
Well, they were a lot alike. They had a lot of the same words.
Someone I heard way in the distant past, there was a Chick and a Chalk.
Said what?
There was two guys named Chick and Chalk.
I don't know. I don't know about that.
That's
But I know, I doubt that. I'll tell you why I doubt it. Because Choctaws don't say chalk. They say Choctaw. A real Choctaw doesn't have a C in it, do they? They say Choctaw.
Choctaw.
Choctaw. And the C comes from the fact that Anglo-Saxons don't like to say a syllable without putting a consonant on the end of it. They want to put, you know, just like they do with the Italian language. Roma, and we call it Rome, because we don't like a strong syllable on the end that's a vowel. And the Choctaws themselves never said Choctaw, Choctaw. They just stopped a little bit, so the whites put a C in there to show that they stopped. They say Choctaw. Choctaw, I used to say. Okay. Is that the way you've heard it said? Choctaw?
Are there clans in the Choctaw?
Yeah, they had Okalafalaya, Long Necks, and 6 towns. Okalahanala, 6 towns.
6 towns.
They were clans within the Choctaw tribe. Grandma was a 6 town and Grandpa was a Okalafalaya.
What do you mean when we say 6 towns? Is that?
There were 6 towns that were of the same division, the Choctaws. They lived in 6 towns back in Mississippi. And they were not what you'd call real enemies, but they didn't all that much get along back in the old days. I don't believe well, the Choctaws had some funny, ideas, I guess you might say funny. They were just their own ideas. But they went to another village to marry. They didn't like you lived in Stickler. You wouldn't marry a Stickler girl. You'd go over to Kinta or Leek or somewhere. And that's probably how they patched up their differences. Because they'd go over somewhere else and marry, and they kept going so far they went to the 6 towns. Grandpa went over to 6 towns. Married a 6 town, but actually by the time Grandpa and Grandma married, there was no real division.
What were the 6 towns in Mississippi? You know?
Where were they?
What were they? The names?
Oh no, I don't know.
How many clans were there in the Choctaw?
I don't know of any more, do you? Other than the Okalafalayas. They lived in 3 districts always. Choctaws did. So there could have been another.
I believe it was, but I don't.
They always lived in 3 districts. And even when they came out here, they set up 3 districts. They had 3 chiefs.
Pushmataha. Is Pushmataha one of the districts?
No, he was one of the
chiefs.
chiefs of a district.
What were the 3 districts?
They were just geographical.
They didn't have a certain name.
No, they would just say east and west and south. And it was the same way here. They set up 3 districts.
Yeah. What about the warrior societies? Do they have?
I don't know anything about that. I really don't.
You say Choctaw only has like 900 or 1,000 words in it?
Well, that's my guess.
Yeah.
I know they were relatively few words. I've seen Choctaw dictionaries, but I don't know. They have more words in
Have
them
you
than
seen
that.
a dictionary?
They have more words than that in there, but I don't know whether some of them have been developed lately.
That's what I was telling
Right.
Because there have been a lot of people messing around with Choctaw language.
Mm-hmm.
But they were, that's a funny thing. I don't know. I hear all this about, Indians are supposed to be this way or that way, but Grandpa was very fun-loving and very big tease, liked to, and he was also a heavy drinker too. He loved that alcohol. He'd go on real drinking sprees. Grandma was a real big Baptist, and she tried to get him to quit drinking. And when he'd get drunk, she'd try to make him hit her. She'd say, "Hit me, Green, hit me, Green." She said she knew if she could get him to hit her, then when he sobered up, he wouldn't drink anymore. He would never hit her. Never gave up his drinking. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I remember. What was your grandmother's name? Katie or
Kitty.
Kitty.
Her real name was Katie.
That's what I thought.
My grandpa called her Kitty.
I heard people refer to her as Katie and then others Kitty, and
She was a spring.
Uh-huh.
And her grandmother was an Anderson, Sally Anderson. Her grandfather was Captain John Anderson. He was white. And her great-grandmother was a Bohannon.
Oh.
So that's one reason Grandpa got elected. Grandma was kin to everybody in the nation.
Yeah.
And of course, Papa Grandma was a Folsom. So that's the Folsoms, Andersons, Bohannons, and Springs, and you about got a good vote there.
Was your grandfather the last elected chief? Yeah. When did they begin electing the chief? Was it ever hereditary?
I don't think, in my memory, it was ever hereditary. And I don't even believe that the election preceded the Anglo-Saxon Association. I think they just accepted certain people as leaders and they became chiefs that way. And because the Choctaws had a trial by jury, unicameral legislation, and a Supreme Court, and a Constitution in 1799. So they very early adopted the civilization of the Anglo-Saxons. They very early adopted. That's one reason a lot of this stuff about the Choctaw lore is faked, because it's been so long since they lived in tribal society. They took over right away. They saw what was good about it. That's one of the things I remember Grandpa's letters saying, that he was called a progressive, which wasn't always a good word in Choctaw country. He had some hard battles to win. But he believed that you couldn't hold back the tide of the Anglo-Saxon race, and that the best thing to do was get the best deal you could out of it. And so that's what he tried to do. And he was maligned by the people. The Snake Indians want to stay full blood. They didn't want anything. They want to stay at war with the whites.
Which group?
Snake Indians, I think they called them. It wasn't solely Choctaws who belonged to the Snake Indian movement. There were other tribes who wanted to resist. And that's what, what was the great Indian leader's name? He was a Delaware. Who fought up around Indiana and Ohio.
The Delaware is known as the grandfather tribe.
You know who I mean? He fought successfully up there around Indiana and Ohio.
All I can think of is Charles Journey Cake, and I know that.
No.
Liz Breads.
No. Well, anyhow, he went down into the Choctaw tribe to try to enlist warriors to help him resist the white movement. And the Choctaws threw him out. They rode him to the boundaries and sent him on his way. I'm sure you know. I'll tell you forward through who it was, but he was the great. And at that time, Pushmataha was the main chief of the Choctaws. I don't remember all of them, but at that time there was Pushmataha and Mushlatubbee, and can't think of the other one. There were three.
I've heard that Pushmataha was in the Battle of New Orleans.
I think he was.
That he had a Choctaw regiment and helped Andrew Jackson defeat the British.
I think he was. The Choctaws aligned with the French first against the British.
And
Of course, they were closer to the French.
Yeah.
Some of the Choctaw Nation went down into Louisiana.
Do you know any stories of Pushmataha or the other chiefs at that time? Where is he buried?
You know, I don't know.
Did he die in
Washington,
Washington?
D.C.?
I sort of think, didn't he die there on a trip, eating too many oysters or something?
He was buried in Washington, D.C.
I believe he was.
Okay.
I said Delaware. I believe this great warrior I was talking about was a Shawnee. Tecumseh.
I was thinking Tecumseh, but I knew he wasn't Delaware.
He was the one that they came down to the Choctaws and they escorted him.
Yeah,
to the
he
mountain.
was killed in the battle, in the War of 1812 in Canada.
Yeah.
Fighting with the Canadians and the British against the U.S. That's...
Well, that's... You know, I've heard people say... You know, I tell you another thing for some of the cultural differences. And that is the Choctaws were more or less a communistic society. And they didn't have the strong feeling of ownership that the Anglo-Saxons had. They didn't build fences around their property. And they didn't have the idea that the ownership of property involved excluding other people. Because they didn't exclude other people. Other people could use their property. They could hunt on it, they could fish on it, they could raise a crop on any part of it that the other guy wasn't using. They didn't exclude people from the use of anything. They thought that the ownership was just a right to enjoy something. But they found out after they first started selling their properties that they were going to be excluded from them. They thought it was foolish for the white man to pay him for something he could already use. But when they found out that he intended to keep them off from it, then they kind of learned a lesson a little bit too little too late, because they didn't have that concept of building a wall around something once you got it and say, you know, nobody can get them on here. This is all mine now. They had so much land and that they didn't have any necessity for excluding people, and they just didn't have that strong a feeling of ownership. And I'll tell you something else. I think it is one of the only things that's come down to us from the old days that I know of is that Choctaws to this day are not all that great when it comes to home loving and staying at home and keeping house and building a great place. They want to get out and go. And I know all of my relatives are like that. They don't take any great pains in settling down, building an empire right here. You know, this is all mine. They want to go to town and visit and go out and see their kinfolks and go to other places. And they count time. My mother counted time keeping house was wasted because it's going to get dirty tomorrow. You know what I mean? So they could find a lot more things that they enjoyed more. And you don't find many big mansions built by Choctaws. They weren't that. They're still a little more oriented toward getting out and going places.
What about, I heard it burned down, but in Mississippi they had the home of Greenwood Floor, which was Malmaison. Is that the name of it?
I don't know anything about Mississippi, except the Choctaws in our family came from Yallowbush County. But I don't know anything about what went on back there. You know, we didn't even have. I just be repeating what I learned in Oklahoma history, except we never had it. In school here in Stickler, they didn't teach Choctaw. They didn't teach Oklahoma history either when I was in school.
How come?
I don't know. The first Oklahoma history I remember seeing, I was in the 8th grade. It had Grandpa's picture in it. But on down in the grades, we didn't have it. I don't know why.
How about the girls' ceremonies? You know what I'm talking about?
Is there anything in the Choctaws that's unique to their burial ceremonies? Because Miss Ward talked about the cry.
Well, you think that's unique to the Choctaws?
I've never heard of it before. I don't know.
Well, I don't know. I know that it's always been customary, the funerals that I go to, that everybody leaves the family with the dead. And they would cry and go on, take on, you know, but I thought everybody did that.
She said this is at the cemetery.
Oh, well, I don't know anything about that.
Yeah.
We didn't ever do it. As a matter of fact, we didn't ever make a show anywhere. We held it in till after we got to ourselves. When any of our family died, we never cried publicly. But I don't know, I'm kind of mixed up. I don't know whether I'm white or Indian. I have never been treated as Indian because I'm not dark.
Yeah.
But I've always been reminded of it because I have brothers and sisters that are dark. And some of them have been treated as Indians.
Mm-hmm.
I always have to explain my Indian situation to people because nobody ever asks me if I'm Indian. But of course, since I've been raised in an Indian family, I'm Indian oriented in the sense of the way I feel, but not in the sense of the way I do, because I've never been in Indian politics or Indian affairs. And I've been away from Oklahoma most of my life. The way I can tell that I'm Indian, I feel more relaxed in the company of Indians than I do in the company of Anglo-Saxons. I feel more at home.
Yeah.
yet I've spent most of my life away from it. See, so that to me, that is the clue, is how you feel.
Yeah.
And I suppose that's because that's the way I was raised. My mother was very Indian. My father didn't look all that much Indian. He had black hair, but he had an Anglo-Saxon face.
When.
Cherokee.
I understand that people said that Stan Whaley should have been the chief instead of John.
I don't know
Ross.
how. Chief Ross was unassailable as a chief. He was the only one they couldn't corrupt.
Yeah,
For 60 years. He never took a payment or
that's
a
true.
bribe or anything. I think he was a very good chief. I knew his granddaughter Florence went to OU with her. She was a fine girl.
She's still living.
I don't know. Never seen her since we were at OU.
How is the tribal council organized? You have the governor, and is there a council?
She could tell you more about that than I could.
I think everyone knows more about it than I do because
I don't
I've
know
been away
anything.
too.
Yeah.
I don't know anything about the Choctaw government now.
How many council members are there?
I believe it's 12.
Well,
I'm not sure.
and then how often is the governor elected?
Some for 2 years and some for 3 years.
No,
The
you
governor.
say the governor.
Oh,
the chief.
no,
The chief, he serves what?
2-year term.
I don't know.
2 years, yeah.
And the council
Oh,
members.
I believe isn't it 4?
You know, I just really couldn't tell you.
Well, he's already served one term, he's elected another term now. That'll be 4 years, if that's as far as he can go, he can't be elected again.
Was he originally appointed because of the death of Gardner?
Mm-hmm. To fill his.
They used to use the term principal chief.
Well, that's because they had 3 chiefs when they were divided into 3 districts.
Okay. So you had the
And
three.
one of them was usually, now I don't think they ever elected a principal chief. I think back in Mississippi, in any event, I believe, as I remember, that they were equal. They were each absolute chiefs of their districts. But that in dealing with the Americans and other tribes, the chief who appeared to be the most powerful was dealt with. And even the 3 would get together. The 3 chiefs would get together, and 2 of them would say, well, to the other one, now, you're the one you're the oldest, or you're the wisest, or whatever. You speak for us. So I think that's the way it came about at that time. There were, at the time you're speaking of Greenwood LaFleur, you know, he was the chief. At the same time, Pushmataha was the chief, and so was Tubby. I believe, I don't know now, I may not have that right. But I know that there were 3 chiefs, and they were of equal stature. But the government preferred to deal with one. The U.S. government preferred to deal with one, so they dealt with the one they felt most powerful.
Now the Tubby, is that the Maytubby family?
No, the Maytubbies are Chickasaws.
This is
Chickasaw.
Musholatubby.
Masholatubby. I would call it like Gringo. And there was another, what was the other one? That at the time they came out here? It was Greenwood LaFleur, but he didn't want to come. And they appointed another one in his place. I can't recall now.
I
who it
can't
was.
recall. I can't.
But he lived over here at Tomahawk. I'll tell you who is related to Masholatubby.
Choctaw German.
I'll tell you who's related to him here is that man that married Lillian Riley. Married Lillian Riley's sister. School teacher here. And then Mrs. Winton was related to Which is the Choctaw word that means king?
King.
An ought to be, let's see, wait a minute.
Did you
It's
get
got
my
a
picture?
tubby on the end. It's got a tubby on the end. Tubby means killer, I think.
It is.
But we're talking about things here you could get out of any Choctaw book. History.
I don't know the I just started in on Choctaw history and all that.
I didn't learn it at home, I'll tell you. Mama didn't know anything about it. Papa did, but he was very quiet, never talked much.
Mm-hmm.
Mural Wright's book has a lot of that.
Yeah. How many? I've heard that one group in the removal landed at Tommy Hall. And how many different groups were there that came from Mississippi? Any idea?
I don't know. I know, I don't know if any landed at Tomahawk or not. I know they came in down on the Red River, you know. They came in on the Red River. And the first I know, they came in down around Fort Towson down in there. And they put a post up here by Fort Smith at Spiral at Scullyville. But I think that was later. I don't know, but I'm sure that's well documented where they landed. I don't know. But I just understood that they sort of spread to Spiral and then on down to Tomahawk and Spiral. But I think they came in down on the river first.
Yeah. No.
You know, the Choctaws at one time owned all the way from in the neighborhood of Hot Springs all the way to the Texas line. And from the Red River up to the Arkansas River, or the Canadian, which was it? Anyhow, that was essentially the area. But the Choctaws didn't really like to live out in that flat country. Or else they just wanted to cling closer together. They never did go out and settle out there in that western part of the state. And later on, the government leased that land from them for other tribes. They called it leased district land. And the land that is now Arkansas was taken back by the federal government after they had given it to the Choctaws, because they found after they had given it to us that there were already white settlers in there. So they took it back and set the new line where the present boundary between Oklahoma and Arkansas is.
Huh.
But the Choctaws didn't like to live where there weren't streams and small game. Because as I understand, I didn't hear this in my raising, but I think I learned it later in life. Choctaws weren't buffalo hunters. They liked quail and prairie chickens and squirrels and rabbits and fish. They weren't all that big for your bigger game. They were small game hunters, and they liked to live in the pines and where the creeks and the hills were, rather than out on the flat country where there was no trees.
Yeah.
Figure that one out. That's so good.
Oh,
I couldn't figure that out.
a Pushmataha district, Pushmataha district, and Moshelatubbee. A Pushmataha must have been the other chief then. Pushmataha. See how they divided it? East, west, and north.
Yeah. Okay.
And that's the way it was in
That's where
Mississippi.
in Indian Territory.
Mm-hmm. Pushmataha. That must have been the chief that took Greenwood and Flor's place.
Now, what does the word Pushmataha mean to you?
I don't know.
I can remember a preacher preaching at Siloam Springs. His name was Tobley. And I knew what it meant, but I tried to get my mom and dad to tell me exactly what,
Mhm.
how to say it. So, I kept messing along and trying to get him to tell me how to pronounce that, or what it meant. And, finally I said, oh, Mr. Push. Because I knew that totally meant push.
Yeah. Yeah, that's what
They
it
called
was.
me totally.
No, I don't know.
But
I don't know most words.
The Shoba is there, isn't he?
It says that 3rd district,
Mm-hmm.
Hayapatoklo,
That's
or
two.
middle. Or middle.
What is 3?
Tukchina.
Tukchina. Chafa, Tuklo, Tukchina, Nali.
Two.
Yeah, how do you count in Choctaw?
He's just counting.
I was just trying to count. I don't know if I can remember it or not. Chafa, Tuklo, Tukchina, Hanali, Hanali. I've forgotten 6.
How do you say 6 town? 6 town? How do you say that?
Oh,
That's 6.
Chafla, Chafa, Tuklo, Tukchina.
Hanali.
I thought that they said that was 6 town. That's what's got me bum fuzzled.
Chafa, Tuklo, Tukchina. And I thought they said Hanali and Hanali. Is the next.
No. 6.
I can't. It's gone. I used to count to
I
10.
can't remember. I could count to 10. That's all further I could go. I can't do that now.
I'd like to ask a question. You don't have to talk about it if you don't want to. I'd like to get some information on the Anzio beachhead.
Well, we went in there in January and came out in, I believe it was May. And of course we were in reserve. We were not in the front line. Armor usually isn't sitting on the front line. They're in reserve. And most of our difficulties, I guess, were mental strain, because we kept building last defense lines. We'd build a last defense line, and then they'd take that, and then we'd build another last defense line. And about the time we made our push to get out, we were about 4 miles from the water. And it was kind of scary just thinking about how near you were. And I knew anyhow, because I was privy to a lot of information. I knew that the British had written us off, and they weren't going to send anybody in there to get us out. And I knew that the Americans had gone along with it under Mark Clark. I'd seen I wrote some of the letters that went out from the general. I wrote all of his letters. And so I knew that if we ever got out of there, we were going to have to get out ourselves. Well, the Americans didn't write us off, fortunately. They kept sending in supplies. And as soon as they'd come in, the Germans would blow them up, because they were sitting up in the hills looking at us, and we were down here, plain view, and when we put anything away, they'd blow it up. But they eventually did secrete enough ammunition and everything to mount it dry and get out. And
why did they choose Anzio land?
Well, they wanted to bypass. They wanted to create a diversion from Casino.
But why pick the place that's ringed by hills?
They were. Well, they didn't plan to stay there, and they almost did make penetration. They were 15 or 17, something like that, 17 miles inland on the first push, first 3 days. But then when the Germans sent reinforcements, they were going to go on to Rome and outflank Casino, see. They couldn't do it. And so it was just a stalemate for all those months. Well, from our standpoint, it was more of a morale problem because we couldn't move. We weren't exactly in combat. We were in the forest there, dug in the ground. And we got bombed and shelled every night or morning, and lost a lot of troops. I think the Americans lost about 200,000 men there. But they were just idle. You were idle all day. Actually, we got out and played volleyball and horseshoes and different things. We'd hear a big gun coming in, we'd run, get in the hole, because you could count to 8 after you heard the rifle, boom, like that, and you could run, get in the hole for it. Yeah. But it was more of a morale problem.
Yeah. Is that Anzio Annie?
Well, I thought we didn't call it that, but it may have been called that. I
That's
don't know. It was a railroad
gun
gun
up in the hills. Yeah.
But it sort of was an insidious thing. People's nerves got bad before they realized. I know I got very, very nervous. But I didn't feel it coming on at all. I mean, it wasn't all that much different from the other days that you spent in the service. But it was just the thing of sitting there and waiting. I guess it caused so much of the trouble because there was a lot of there were a lot of boys that just went to pieces there. And a lot of the rest of us have got pretty shaky. Mm-hmm. That stayed with you all your life. But no, it wasn't, it was sort of like shotgun nervousness. It wasn't rifle nervousness. You know, it just a lot of things weighing on you.
And were you on the breakout?
I was a secretary for the general, so I really wasn't a soldier as far as, I was just a civilian working in the Army from that standpoint. I wasn't in the fighting part of it, but of course our division, yes, was the only Army division there. We were instrumental in the breakout.
Mm-hmm. How many, it was the 36th Division, 45th Division, and who else were there at Anzio?
Of the 3rd Infantry, wasn't the 3rd Infantry there?
And you were with the 1st Armored?
I was with the 1st Armored. The 443rd Special Services, the Hawaiian Regiment, I think it was 443rd, and the Special Services and the Rangers were there. And the 1st Armored, 35th, the 36th, 3rd, I believe the 3rd was still there. No, let's see. Seemed like the 3rd got sent back. They got run over outside a casino there. I believe they got sent back home, and it was just the 45th and the 1st. I don't remember about the 1st Infantry, whether they were there or not. They were in Africa with us.
Yeah.
1st Infantry.
What was the lay of the land like there at Anzio?
Just flat.
Just flat?
It was swampland. It had been, see, what was it they called that on the old maps? Sistine Swamp? Something like that. It was a swamp. And it had been drained and planted in pine trees by Mussolini. And then the hills around it were just rolling hills. When we broke out, we had, the 1st Armored Division had one force that went straight up the expressway toward Rome as a diversion. They weren't hoping to capture anything. They were supposed to make a lot of noise and be a diversion. And then the main force came from the east side and moved northwesterly across toward the highway and moved. There was a railroad track they went down. And I remember there was a captain who was a West Pointer in our outfit, and the general called him in there. He was an engineer, captain. He called him in and he told him that he was giving him the assignment to go up the expressway and with several tanks and make a lot of noise and shoot and raise hell. And the captain said to the general, "Well, General, that's a bowling alley." He said, "You don't mean you want to send troops up that highway? That's just a regular bowling alley." And the general said, "Captain, are you telling me that you don't want to go?" And he said, "I certainly am." "Well, you know, that's the last time I ever saw that captain. I never read anything about him being in trouble for refusing an order or wanting to get out of it. I guess the general figured if he didn't want to go, he didn't want him to go."
Yeah.
But I never heard anything more about it, nor said anything more about it. I was sitting in the tent when he said that. He sent another guy up there in charge named Major Lee from, he wasn't a West Pointer, he was from the Virginia Military Academy. And he was a major. Well, they're both majors then. I call him captain because I knew them when they were captains. But he took the job and he went up and he lost a leg. But I often wonder whatever happened to that other major.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure he got cashiered out of the Army. But the thrust was successful, and we went. I guess took us about 2 days to go into Rome after we broke out in May. I was scared myself. I don't know if I could have taken it. If I had just come in straight from Africa, even, I guess I could have done anything anyone else did. But the reason I've always been rather sympathetic with that captain is he'd been with us all the time, too. And I'm sure he was just about as nervous and shaky as I was at the time. And whether I could have taken troops up that bowling alley, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Where were you when the Germans surrendered?
I was home.
You were home then. Okay.
But I was in North Africa. When the Germans surrendered there, they came to my tent. The general in charge of the... I was working for the general, General Harmon at the time, and he was out. And the Germans, we had just so torn them up that they had no communication. They didn't know where their troops were. And this lieutenant general that was in charge of the German army there, came driving up to our tent. I was the only one there, and I went to meet him. And he could speak pretty good English. He was dirty, tired looking, and worn out. Had some officers with him, and he said he wanted to surrender. So I told him I'd have to get one of the staff officers. So I called General Rose. At that time it was Colonel Rose. He had come over to us from the 2nd Armored Division with Patton. And I called him, and I was very excited,
Mm-hmm.
"Colonel Rose, the Germans are here and they want to surrender." He said, "Quiet down, Scotty." He said, "Don't get excited." He said, "Tell them to sit down." He said, "I'll be over there in about half an hour." He said, "Go get Cobb and tell him to heat me some water in my helmet. I'm going to shave. Tell him to bring my clean boots, and I'll be over there in about half an hour. Oh, and he said, and call G2 and tell him to get a man there with a camera." So I did all that, and I sat there with that German and his officers, and we waited about 35, 40 minutes. He came over. Looked like $1 million. All smooth. He was about 6'1", straight as an arrow. Had his riding quirt in his hand, his helmet on, his pink pants and boots and everything. And he comes walking in, He was Jew, too. So I know he got a big kick out of it, accepting that German surrender. But the German was crying when they took the picture. I kind of felt sorry for him. He just standing there crying. General Rose standing up there about that much taller than he was.
Did you and the German guy talk much while you were waiting?
But That was May, I think May 10th, 1940. Would it have been 42, I guess. I don't know if it's 42 or 43. I think it's 42. But I'll never forget that. Rose later was killed at Aachen in Germany. He became a commander of the 3rd Armored Division. Mm-hmm. And then after the war, 3rd Armored and the 1st Armored stayed over in Germany. But he was killed, I believe, before the war was over. Rose was. I read about it. He was in a quarter ton, and he got a little bit too far and took a wrong road or something and ran into a German patrol. And they captured him, and he had a carbine over his shoulder. And he went for his gun, and they shot him after they'd captured him. And I'm sure that that's true, because he didn't think that any German could take him. He was a great soldier, Rose was.
Yeah.
He was World War I OCS.
How far into Europe did you get?
Only went to Bologna, south of Bologna, in Rome, north of Rome and south of Bologna. I was 2.5 years in Italy.
Mm-hmm.
I really liked Italy. Nice country. I went to all the churches and saw all the great paintings. And you know what? I took up painting after seeing all that. I thought it didn't look too difficult.
You do it?
Yeah,
Well,
I can paint pretty good. Do portraits. Of course, I took some academic training in it later, but that's when I started it. I met Ernie Pyle over in North Africa. Mm-hmm. He used to sit outside our tent, and I would also knew this other writer that I really liked his writing better than Ernie Pyle. Was it Doyle? Anyhow, the writers would have to wait until I could get him in to see the general, because I'd handle his appointments. Mm-hmm. I'd sit out and talk to him. I knew Ernie Pyle pretty well. I didn't see anything distinguishing about him then. He's just another newspaper man.
What about Bill Malden?
I never did know Bill Malden. Never did meet him. He was in the 45th, and I suppose they were there at the time, but I never did. I used to read his stuff. Mm-hmm. Enjoyed it.
Ever meet Patton?
Yeah. I didn't like Patton. Patton had a high, squeaky, effeminate voice. And he had a little narrow shoulders, great big hips. That kind of George Washington syndrome, you know. He was tall, about 6'4", but he was built pear-shaped like that. And he was real white and pasty-like, and his jaws kind of hung down. He had a little tiny mouth. And he looked like an old woman with a hat on, with a men's clothes on. You know what I mean? He looked like an old woman, had little fine wrinkles. He didn't have much beard. He was real, I would say, he wasn't an attractive person. And he didn't have a manner that was in keeping with his words. I answered. So I always stayed on the line when I put the general on. If he had another line, I'd stay on the line, take down notes. And it was Patton. And he said to General Ward, he said, "Pinky?" He had a real high, squeaky voice. He said, "Pinky, you had anybody killed today?" General Ward said, "Well, we've been pretty lucky, Georgie." He said, we had about 10 enlisted men, about all we lost. And General Patton said, "You lose any officers?" General Ward said, "No, we were lucky today. We didn't lose any officers." General Patton said, "Lucky hell." get some of them officers out there and get them shot. Be good for the men's morale. He said, I want you to get a second lieutenant up on every OP until you get one killed. You hear that, Pinky? And General Ward said, is that an order, General Patton? He said, you're damn right, that's an order. So the general had to do it. He had to put a lieutenant up on every OP till he got one kill. And he took them all. But that's kind of a person he was. He was a real nasty talker. I'm sure he was efficient. And his record proves that, but he wasn't a very nice person. One time he came into the headquarters and I was in the tent. I wasn't in the tent, I was in my little tent across, but I saw him coming. I was supposed to be in my tent, in the general's tent. So I ran over there, but I couldn't find my helmet. So instead of running straight across, I ran around back that way and came in the back, and he was there, and I saluted him, told him who I was, and he asked me where the general was, and I told him, and he said to me, where's your helmet, soldier? And I told him, I said, well, it's in my tent. He said, you're supposed to be wearing it. You know there's an order. And I said, yes, sir, I know there is. And I'll tell you the truth, I couldn't find it, and I wanted to hurry over here. So he said, well, you just hurry back over there and get it, soldier. So I started across there, to get my helmet. He called me back. He said, that's not the way you came, soldier. You came sneaking around behind the back. You go back the same damn way. Well, that just kind of, it's so unnecessary,
Yeah. Right.
But of course, I remember it, But I didn't like him. Maybe that's why I didn't. But he was so pushy for his personal glory. That's why I didn't like him. He used to come into the area with his hands on his pistol, standing up in his vehicle, in the back seat. Standing up. Had his cameraman and everything. He'd come in like that. And one day, he had an appointment to see our general, and we knew he was coming. And General Ward ran down to, General Ward was a very modest, very nice man. And he ran down to the gate post to welcome him. He was so busy looking important, he didn't even see General Ward. He rode right past him and splattered mud on him and ran right up into the camp, standing there with his hands on his gun. He was some showboat. But he was, as I say, I didn't particularly care for the man. But we didn't get to vote on it.
Well,
that ought to do it, oughtn't it?
yeah. Anything more about the Choctaws? Anything you wanna ask?
Well, I will say one thing that I should have told you in the first place. Grandpa was 6'4". It was either 6'4" or 6'6". I can't remember. Of course, I never saw him. But Mama said he died 2 days after Christmas in 1910. And what caused his death or contributed to it? He bumped his head on the door. There was a double door between the living room and the dining room. And it had a rod on it with a curtain on it. And the curtain was pulled back. So just the rod was exposed. It was brass. And Grandpa had to stoop to go under the door. This particular time, he didn't stoop, and he bumped his head right along there. He was only 62. And it set up blood poisoning. He got a staphylococcus infection from it, and it killed him. He only lived 3 days. Mama said he jumped the fence coming up onto the porch the day before he got sick. He was very active at the time. But anyhow, Mom said his head swelled up real big, just real big, and I guess blood vessels broke. But anyhow, she said when he was dying, she said the last word he said was, my people, what will happen to my people? And that's the last words he uttered.
He followed your grandfather as chief. Definitely.
Who followed him?
I just, who was the next leader?
I guess it must have been old
Velvet?
no, Durant was before him. Will Durant? I don't know when they started appointing chiefs again. Well, they wanted to deal with they had to have a chief because they wanted to take our coal land away from us. Probably. I know that during the war, that's what Brown and I were talking about when I was on Angio. Mama wrote to me that the government was trying to take the Choctaw coal under the War Powers Clause for the good of the national defense. And Papa had been one of the surveyors who selected the coal for segregation. There were several 100,000 acres of it. And the government appraised the coal. Papa said, I don't remember now the figure, it was either 2 cents or 8 cents a ton. Can't remember. The reason I'm foggy on that is because I believe the total value was 8 million. I remember that they were going to pay the Choctaws for the coal. So the 8 gets me confused. I don't remember if it was 8 cents a ton or 2 cents a ton. But anyhow, Papa said it was very much underappraised, and that he was not in favor of selling the coal, and Mama wasn't either, of course. So she wrote to me and asked me to prepare a letter to circulate among the Choctaws to keep them from voting for the coal. See, they couldn't keep the government from taking it, but they could refuse the price that was offered. So they put it to a vote, and the Choctaws voted to take the price that they were offered. In spite of all the people that tried to persuade them not to, they wanted the money in their hands.
Yeah.
So they took it. And the last I heard, I don't know if it's 2 cents or 8 cents, but the last I heard from the land people out in New Mexico, they were wanting $12 a ton just for royalty. So the royalty nominal normally is 1/8 of the value. So that they apparently valued it now at $100 a ton. And as I say, they gave us either 2 cents or 8 cents. So, but that was Will Durant, Bill Stigler, sorry to say, were involved in the sale of that coal. Because Bill Stigler at the time was a congressman. And Will Durant, I think, was the chief at the time. Anyhow, they sold it.
That was in 1930, Durant, 1937 and 48.
Yeah.
Okay.
And he was the chief.
Are there many active coal mines now in the area here?
Well, now, see, you're talking about two different things now. The Choctaw coal that's segregated is not surface coal. Originally, they segregated it for the deep coal, which Kerr-McGee more or less has a lease on all the deep coal around here. But of course, since they segregated all the coal under these lands, they also own the shallow coal too. But they didn't put a very great value on the shallow coal. It was the deep coal that they valued. But of course now, what the government is leasing the land for now is not deep coal, but shallow coal. And there are no deep coal mines. There hasn't been a deep coal mine since World War One. Anywhere, has there? A new one? I know there hasn't been in this area. The McCurtain mines go back to World War One. The last shaft, the only one Kerr-McGee put down here, and they never did operate it.
I understand there was a mine explosion at McCurtain.
I don't know anything about it. Choctaws used to operate their own mines. I know that. Old Pewterball from Kansas City operated them on a leased out arrangement. They didn't make any money on it. And this Hampton Tucker I told you about was for a long time a coal inspector. He went to school at Spencer Academy with my dad. His son is practicing law over at McAllister.
Mm-hmm.
Might get more information out of him.
Okay, do you have any questions?
Ready?
Thank you.
I went to Sign Boys. I can remember your grandmother, Kitty.
Yeah. Grandma was a gray-eyed.
I don't know how old I was, but anyway, right after lunch, she wanted her son-in-laws and in-laws to come and remove the cover from Green's grave so that she could see him. And you should see everybody's cadaver.
Oh,
They
really?
all left,
Yeah.
got out of the way just as soon as they got through eating because she ran around and just begged people
Yeah.
to come.
Grandma was really something when she was, the last year of her life. She used to run around in the house after she became delirious and senile. She'd run around in our house looking for Grandpa. She said, Green, Green, Green. She'd come through the room going down. I'd say, well, Grandma, he's been dead since 1910. No, he isn't either. She said, I saw him just a while ago going through the door. Green, Green, as she'd run around after. She was, but Grandma had candy-colored hair and gray eyes when she's a girl, she said. Couldn't speak Choctaw. She was English till she went to school.
Where'd you go to school?
Oh, some little. I think my grandma went to Tuscaloosa.
Mm-hmm.
Well, you see, we were talking about them going to Tuscaloosa. When Dad went, they wouldn't let him speak the language.
Well, they tried. Now that's what that's what Mom and Papa wouldn't let me,
No.
because they didn't want me to have an accent.
How come they wouldn't let you speak the language?
They didn't want me to learn because they thought it would be a handicap.
Yeah, that's what Dad was.
Because you'd have an accent.
I
See?
can't understand that.
Well, I don't know. Aunt Jenny Lucas, Mama's cousin, she had a kind of an Indian accent, don't you think? You remember her?
Mm-hmm.
And she went to 11th grade in school. She was very well educated, but she never did get out of that Indian accent. So maybe, maybe they afraid we'd sound foreign.
Just born in them, wasn't it?
No, I don't think.
That accent?
No, I don't believe it's born in them. I think a lot of it's from going to Indian schools. You look at Lucian Scantlin. He's whiter than I am, and he has a little bit of a Choctaw slang, and he went to Jones. Pick it up, talking with them bulldogs.
He spent a lot of time with Campbell Perry.
Yeah.
That's where he got a lot of his information.
Yeah.
Choctaw information, history.
Lucian would probably knows more about things like that than I do. As a matter of fact, Sleeta's mother was an Indian doctor.
Who?
Sleeta Scantlin. Her mother.
And Kitty.
Yeah,
Was an Indian doctor?
Yeah, she was an herb doctor.
That's her grandmother, right?
And she used to go out and dig these roots and things.
I'd like to talk to her.
Well, Sleeta doesn't know much about the herbs.
Yeah.
And the old lady's dead.
I had thought about talking to her.
As Lita said, though, she hadn't picked up any of that. She said she wished she hadn't paid no attention to it.
She doesn't know.
Do you know of any of the home remedies they used?
This,
Blackberry juice.
making a record.
Blackberry juice for your stomach.
Is that good for you?
Yes, and I understand now that it's one of the highest things you can get in potassium. It's higher than orange juice. So that's probably why. That's why it worked out that way.
Yeah, right.
No, I don't know. They used coal oil and sugar, but that's white man's remedy, wasn't it?
Yeah, there's I guess Miss Baker she would burn pea holes.
Yeah, we did that too, but we made soda out of that.
Yeah. Now, what's in the pee hole that's good for you?
Alkali. It's
Alkali.
Well, we used it. Mama used it to put in hominy
Uh-huh.
for soda instead of soda.
We were talking about that soap. Mrs. Baker was telling us how to make that soap. And after, I don't know, there was all kind of programs coming out. And Catherine, she's now, Catherine Hatley. She'd go around and she'd tell people how to can food and all this. And she taught them how to make this lye soap, and they would put something in it to make it float. And I thought that was the funniest thing.
Yeah.
Mama had old homemade soap that would float.
The float? Yeah. We always had lye soap. But I used to make that in the pot.
You did.
But I don't think that was particularly Indian. Everybody else was doing it too.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. That's why I say that woman,